Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. With the release of Goldfinger in 1964, Bond mania kicked off imitations in all other medium, like television with Man from U.N.C.L.E. Of course, in comics, you had things like Spy-Man. Even Archie got in on the trend. Of course, DC handled it goofily. Not like over at Marvel, because you had Jack Kirby creating Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. But by 1966, he could only do layouts over other illustrators, like this new guy in 66 named Jim Steranko, who by 67 was both writing and drawing his own strip, the first time in Marvel history. Jim Steranko, who would use Nick Fury as his doppelganger to introduce new graphic ideas torn from the day's popular culture. He would bring psychedelia into comic book art, making him, yes, the Jimi Hendrix of comics, with his multimedia melange of graphic styles and innovations. And then in 69, he would do a trilogy of Captain America stories that many Captain America aficionados to this day consider Captain America's greatest moments, with covers like these and full pages that have become icons. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the supercharged psychedelia of Steranko. My name's Arlen Schumer. I did a book about comic book art in the 1960s that, of course, included Steranko, the Silver Age of comic book art, about comic book art in the 1960s represented by these 8 men whom I believe, in the same way we look back 500 years ago on the Renaissance masters of the human figure, like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael, so too do I believe 500 years from now, future art historians will be looking back on these men as our Renaissance masters. And as you can see on this title table of contents, I tried to attach a quote of each artist that represented how they saw themselves. I don't consider myself an artist. I'm just a storyteller. Well, by the end of this webinar, folks, you be the judge about Steranko's self-assessment. Every artist begins with a double-page spread in which I ghost behind my introductory text on the right-hand page, a piece of art that best represented them to go alongside of the full-color portrait image, so to speak. That would be, of course, Nick Fury. And there's that great Captain America page. Now, of course, Nick Fury, the younger audience knows from the movies now, played by Samuel L. Jackson, and the TV show that recently ended on ABC after 7 seasons, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. These were, of course, all created by Jack Kirby, the legendary Jack Kirby, who at Marvel in 1963, after creating the Fantastic Four and Hulk and things like that, did a World War II character based on his own. You know, he went to war with Patton, Jack Kirby. So he creates Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. Now, this was his kind of competition to the already established by 1959 DC Comics World War II icon, Joe Kubert and writer Bob Kanigher's Sergeant Rock and his Combat Happy Joes of Easy Co., to contrast with the Howling Commandos of Kirby's. But it was Kirby who, in the wake of James Bond's success in 1965, creates what really is a very significant pop culture reboot, as we call them today, by coming up with a way to bring Sergeant Fury from World War II into 1965 present day as a James Bond knockoff Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., which debuts in the early summer of '65. Of course, Kirby, who's basically drawing every Marvel cover and doing 3 books a month or whatever, could only do layouts for other artists to do tight pencils over and inks. So it wasn't really a complete Kirby book, but it had Kirby's storytelling and, of course, his concepts. Now, writing the dialogue and narration and editing was, of course, Stan Lee, shown here in one of the very few, if only, photographs of the two of them together in the 1960s. Now, without getting into a whole discussion, which is a whole nother discussion, I do believe that Jack Kirby was the storyteller, meaning he created the stories and the characters. I only think Lee acted as an editor and acted as the writer of the dialogue and narration over Kirby's ideas. But of course, in the end, Lee took credit as the writer, i.e. creator of the stories. Now, before he was partners with Lee at Marvel in the early 60s, Jack Kirby was partners for 20 years prior with Joe Simon, who was also a writer as well as an artist. But in the way the two of them worked, he was also more of the businessman. Anyway, by the end of the 50s, they had split up, and Joe Simon was over at Harvey Comics. And by the time of the Bond Mania hit, he is editing a series of Harvey. You know, Harvey was known for Casper and Little Lotta and Funny Animal and comedic books. So this was them jumping into the Bond Mania game. Now, who created Spy Man? Not Joe Simon. A young artist who came to his doorstep named Jim Steranko from Reading, Pennsylvania, with concept illustrations and drawings and lettering that looked like this. And Spy Man was, of course, Steranko's knockoff of the Bond craze. Now, here's a photograph of Steranko, probably from a year or two after that, but one of the very few photographs that exists in those days. Not a lot of photographs of any of the comic artists. That's comic history in general. But yes, Steranko's graduation from high school. Escape artist, are you kidding me? Yes, Steranko was a very, according to all reports, very excellent escape artist. As you can see in these pictures and in these promotion pieces. And yes, it is true that he would be the inspiration years later for Jack Kirby's Mr. Miracle, one of his Fourth World books for DC Comics in 1971. Now, it was images like this that Steranko would also show after the Joe Simon tenure ended. He would, in 1966, show these samples, yes, to Stan Lee. This is probably a photograph circa 1965, a couple years later. But, well, no, I'm sorry, this is from the time. This is actually probably a year or so before, because this is the tryout that Lee gave to Steranko over, I believe, Kirby layouts, maybe. You know, I'll have to go back and research this a little further. But you can see elements of both Steranko and Kirby in these very primitive early breakdowns. A lot of text, as you can see, more than Steranko would end up doing. But it was on the basis of these samples that Lee brought in Steranko in 1966. It had to be sometime in the summer or fall, because this book came out in the fall. That means it was created in the spring, summer of '66. And yes, it's the first time, because Kirby had been penciling all of the covers and only doing layouts for the interiors. But yes, we see this odd name Steranko for the first time. And in the interior, we see his name, an image I showed in my opening presentation, but there's jaunty Jim Steranko. But it wasn't very long, maybe 2 issues or so, that Steranko must have impressed upon Lee his ability to both write and draw the strip. Now, Nick Fury obviously wasn't an A seller at Marvel. It was probably a grade B or C book. So maybe Lee could afford to let this young whippersnapper, because Marvel had never allowed anybody to write and draw their stuff, even though Kirby and Ditko were, in a sense, writing their stories. They just weren't able to dialogue or narrate them. And Lee did. Notice Lee will always put his editing credit even before the writer illustrator. But yeah, so right away, this guy, Jim Steranko, comes out of nowhere, because I don't remember seeing any of those Harvey books. I never saw Spy Man, and I was a kid. My brother and I were buying comics regularly. But this is an early press coverage of Steranko, and it had to be circa 1967, where you can see the image he's already presenting is a very professional image. You know, Steranko, born in 1938, is, 28 years old here. He's not a kid, and yet he's not obviously an older seasoned professional, but he's definitely presenting a very professional, slick, erudite appearance, for a so-called comic artist. Here's another early coverage of Steranko. He had a meteoric rise even in the comic fan world, obviously, because these are from, late 60s, very rare fanzine coverages. But what Steranko was doing was taking from one of his major, if not his greatest influence, what am I saying? Jack Kirby, Jim Steranko's greatest influence, because he was only a year before, in early 66, that Kirby puts out one of his greatest images, maybe the greatest single image of victory and defeat in a single image, not only in the history of comics, but probably the history of art itself. Also the debut, by the way, of Kirby Crackle, the circular black dots representing energy that Kirby pretty much patented. But Steranko would take an image and an energy like this, and a year later, over in Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., would feed it back, but, amped up a little, on steroids, we would say today. I mean, look at this Kirby 1967 panel that is a primer in the art of action, superheroic, bold anatomy. I mean, you could teach a class on this illustration alone. But here's Steranko being Kirby's greatest student and feeding that same energy back, but on steroids. He soon was able to hook up Nick Fury with his boyhood icon, Captain America, in S.H.I.E.L.D. I mean, wow, check out the splash page. These are the kinds of designs and graphic techniques that Steranko was doing in 1967. This is even before Neil Adams was doing anything significant in comics, in mainstream color comics, at least on this level. Also, notice how in short order, Steranko transforms Kirby's Nick Fury, the guy in the suit and tie, into this guy with the very slick, high-tech, blue-black jumpsuit. Now that's a Kirby hand as modified by Steranko. All of Steranko's anatomy is essentially him taking Kirby and just doing it his way. And how about this full page where he gets to team up Nick Fury and Captain America in all his Kirby-esque splendor. Each cover that he would do in succession would just seem to be bursting with more and more energy in a pure graphic sense, because it's only 7 months later or 6 months later, we get one of his most iconic covers, one of his famous white covers. And not only were his covers spectacular, but every splash page, which is what page one is always called, was always a incredible graphic surprise in which he would use what's called zipatone in the background for the type, the gradation, which was plastic sheets of film with adhesive on the back that were printed with a gradated dot pattern that you could use in line art, which is what Steranko brought over from his stint. In addition to being an escape artist, he was in rock and roll bands, but he was also in advertising agencies, similar to Neil Adams also, in a way. Here's another great Zipatone cover to do the shadow in Zipatone, and then to use a very graphic pattern in the background. Now, Steranko's biggest influence on his own artwork, I would have to say, is the great Will Eisner, who did The Spirit, because look at his splash pages from pretty much 20 years earlier in the late 40s, in this case, a pretty late Spirit, 1951. But you can see how from just this one splash page alone, the sense of drama that Steranko brought to his artwork also from Eisner, but it was all the graphic techniques that Eisner had innovated in the late 40s that had been forgotten in mainstream comics, like mixing photography with comic art. This, and I checked this with some experts, this is the first use of photography in comic book art, 1948, I believe. And then less than 20 years later, you would get this great splash page by Steranko. Notice he's even calling what he's doing cinematography, but it's a pun on, of course, the movie marquee. But how about not only great exteriors, but interiors, like this very Mad Men-esque sunken living room, bachelor pad, you know, as only Nick Fury would have. Look at the piece of op art. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But again, the mix of photography with comics was always fun and surprising when Steranko would do it with memorable images like this. As you follow the text along to traditional comic art in the left panel, you get this mixture of psychedelic art with, again, a photographic rendering of the city. And it was this mixture of psychedelic artifacts circa 1967, 68. And this is at the height of psychedelic and pop art in the broader American culture. But Steranko is doing it in comics. And we had never seen stuff like this before. I mean, when we saw images like this is only 3 years after Steve Ditko did a mind meld between Dr. Strange and his ancient mentor, the Ancient One. But Steranko took it further into a more photographic-based psychedelic effect. So you'd get panels that look like this. But at the same time, Steranko could be a traditionalist and do great effects panels like that telephone booth explosion. And how about this beautiful graphic technique as we come down the page to a beautiful use of another graphic technique called craft tint paper, which was artboards treated with an invisible cross-hatching that would become visible when you applied clear liquid with a brush or a pen nib. And that would bring up the two different sets of lines to get that cross-hatching effect with two different liquids. Yeah, it's in this age of Photoshop, it's antiquated, but when the right artist used it, it could be very, very dramatic. And Steranko knew how to shift between full color and when to do black and white with these incredible effects that years later, decades later, we're still trying to figure out how he did it. Now, Steranko was influenced by, again, the pop culture of his time. This was the height of op art, which was an offshoot of pop art, which was centered on the opticals of art, like these gradiated lines, this being, of course, the famous Museum of Modern Art show that kind of anointed op art as a legitimate art form. Up until then, it was considered a novelty. Now, this is British artist Bridget Riley, who was the doyenne of op art, with her many variations on that piece of art in the background behind her. Now, Steranko took concepts and ideas like this and, of course, brought it to comics. In the spring of '68, when this incredible cover appeared, probably, maybe it's Steranko's single greatest cover, but it's certainly an amalgam of the very same psychedelic art. Again, here's the major domo of that field, Peter Max. He called what he did in the '60s as his cosmic paintings or his cosmic works. But Steranko not only took from the pop art, the psychedelic art of his time, but once again would reach back to Eisner. And keep in mind, folks, unless you saw those two 25-cent Spirit annuals that Harvey put out in '66, you didn't know about these Eisner influences. You had to be a real comic book aficionado to know about stuff like this. But you can see the influence on Steranko and how he made it totally his own while paying homage. I mean, there's as much Eisner, but there's more Steranko in this incredibly beautiful splash page. When you open up the page, you get this pretty incredible double page spread, which feels like a film. You know, when they call comics film on paper, there are many ways to interpret that. We're still having arguments about what that means, but here's a perfect example by Steranko of film on paper, in which you get the very Bondian equivalent of what is called the pre-credit sequence, although in this case, because of the splash page, we already saw the quote credits. But it has the feeling of a silent Bond opening, like the one in Goldfinger, if you know the opening sequence there. But you can see that each vertical panel represents the same amount of time, like a camera training itself on each scene in the same amount of time. And now we get into the semantics and the syntactics of comic book storytelling. But with a double page spread like this, Steranko is basically creating, I would call this a mini masterpiece in comic book storytelling. That issue, just every page would be another graphic surprise in which Nick Fury is going through a literal maze and Steranko is creating his panel designs like a maze itself so that form follows function. These are the things I learned at RISD in graphic design. Now, in underground comics, Robert Crumb at the same time is dropping acid and drawing pages like this that is considered, in a sense, psychedelic art of its time. Steranko is not dropping acid, but doing psychedelic layouts like this, in which you had to literally turn the page around to get the full effect of what Steranko wanted you to feel while Nick Fury is going through this graphic gauntlet, so to speak. But Steranko could also manipulate panels to be film on paper, like in the top, building up the intensity. You know, art is all about tension and release. I forget which art critic famously said that. But Steranko understands tension and release because he times the tension of each page of his storytelling so that when you would turn a page like this, you would be hit with a double page spread that had this amount of really awesome energy. In the cliche, when you say in every line, Steranko made every line count for making the total effect be what he wanted you to feel. And not just double page spreads. No, he wasn't satisfied with just double page spreads. You think this scene ends on this double page spread? No, when you turn the page, you were hit with the rest of the scene, meaning you had to get 2 issues of the comic and line them up side by side, like I'm doing here, thanks to the magic of Keynote, to show you the full effect, the panorama-like storytelling that Steranko wanted you, the reader, to experience in a way nobody had ever experienced before. Now, Steranko doing Nick Fury, basically doing his take on James Bond, was obviously taking what he loved about the previous year's You Only Live Twice and the famous volcano interior set designed by the great Ken Adam and the big fight at the end. And there is, of course, the movie poster for 67's You Only Live Twice. The reason why I'm showing it is because the beautiful women in the Bond films were not exactly left behind by Steranko, as you can see in this full page image of his, Nick Fury paramour, Val. And that brings us to this full page, which at the time was considered a very racy sequence when the Comics Code ruled and you could not show sex of any type in comics. Steranko implied it graphically. And I think the story goes, he originally had the phone off the hook and they made him change it, but they let him keep the gun in the holster, something like that. But you see, while Steranko could be soft and tender as a graphic designer, knowing when to switch gears, he would then turn around and give you a panel like this. This was a half page. And by the way, kids, study the use of force lines inked in the background there, and how much energy they give a work of comic art. Notice his use of Kirby crackle, his homage there. So yes, Steranko could travel a stylistic spectrum from high energy images like this that are operating on all cylinders, and then the very next issue going gothic with another classic cover. I mean, at this point, folks, in 1968, every Steranko issue was, in a sense, an event because he would always graphically surprise us. Once again, I didn't know until years later that he was probably paying homage to this Bob Powell cover of Shadow Comics, 1948. You can maybe see its influence in his very modern yet traditionally Gothic treatment. How about this splash page? Again, Steranko, the graphic designer, art director, knowing how to use type and text. And once again, I'd say the Eisner influence. Eisner did everything first. He's the D.W. Griffith of comic book art. And at the time, I had never seen that Eisner thing. But once again, Steranko just makes it his own. Then you would turn this page and another incredibly sophisticated graphic. Remember I told you graphic design is verbal, visual, words, and pictures. Well, that's exactly what Steranko is doing. And here is the full spread. I'm trying to best duplicate, even though in real time, when you bought the comic, you saw the whole spread. I'm trying in the use of this technology to kind of duplicate the feeling of, again, like film on paper is how Steranko paced the stories. His use of white space as an artist, whether you're a painter, whether any type of art, you know about the use of white space, of negative space. And Steranko created a handful or two of incredibly graphic, iconic imagery that is also about the beautiful use of white space. So you get this cover. After his Gothic treatment, we go back to Steranko black and white psychedelia, which is probably influenced by the great illustrator Bob Peak, who in the mid-60s was doing magazine layouts and illustrations like this that would combine so many of the graphic looks of the day, of the mid-60s, coming over from London and Carnaby Street, the fashion of the time. Steranko even took from the comics of the time. This is a year before, in '67, with, I think the artist is Tony Tallarico, kind of a journeyman Charlton Comics artist. But you can see how Steranko might have noticed this and said, you know, I could do that a hell of a lot better. And that's exactly what he does with this icon. And I say icon because there have been so many homages and parodies and homage/parodies. And I even like when somebody took the concept and kind of did their own twist on it, while at the same time paying homage to it as well. What does Steranko do to follow up this cover? He gives us yet another white cover, but this time going totally psychedelic, as opposed to, I mean, psychedelic colors, as opposed to the black and white of the previous cover. We're blessed in these internet days to find posted examples like Steranko's color rough for the cover. And then there's this, looks like colored pencil version. How about the character in the center there? That's pretty wild, right? But you could see how Steranko, you know, in the end made all the best decisions. Although Scorpio is still pretty funky, I think. Needless to say, what could Steranko do to top himself after this psychedelic gem? He goes out of this world with this. By the way, by issue 4, he had stopped drawing the Shield interiors. I think issue 3 was his last interior. He's only doing the covers at this point, because his work is really taking too long to produce, because he's putting too much time and sweat into it. So instead, he gives us these cover masterpieces. Now, Steranko is paying homage to the great Wally Wood, who in the 1950s, for EC Comics in the early part of the decade, he stakes his claim as the greatest science fiction comic artist of all time. Even before this, he had worked with Eisner on the Spirit when Eisner wanted to send the Spirit into outer space. This is 1952. And he gets Wally Wood to really pencil and ink it over, I guess, Eisner's layouts, maybe. And then there's the early 50s Frank Frazetta, who's doing comic art every now and then. And this is one of his most famous, pun intended, famous funnies, Buck Rogers covers with the looming red planet. And then you get mainstream illustration like this paperback cover that I must have found online somewhere as being a possible influence. And then there's the good old comic book influence, one of my favorite covers of all time, an all-time icon by the great Carmine Infantino, inked by his soulmate inker, Murphy Anderson, from 1964. Now, you can almost see the difference between the DC approach to superheroics, which is very medium shot and almost very quiet, almost like a frozen tableau in the Museum of Natural History. But that's also what we love about these covers. And then you get Steranko's, which literally pulses with an energy and a dynamic. And it too has become a much parodied icon in so many different graphic styles. Even Steranko himself has recreated it probably many times over for commissions. Free plug here. And what can it do to top that cover? What? Surrealism. I didn't even think as a 10-year-old I knew what surrealism was. And it was only thanks to the internet I could research covers like this to find maybe the graphic influence. Salvador Dali's cover for Vogue in 1944. And perhaps, especially the receding perspective lines of the landscape. At this time, Steranko is getting more and more press coverage in the so-called fan press of the time. But remember, folks, these are very, very rare in the sense of there wasn't a lot of photography, a lot of, these scraps are like little, holy grail, so to speak. Now, after he finished with S.H.I.E.L.D., Steranko starts looking at the rest of the Marvel landscape and deciding what he wants to do after he had just set the world on fire the past 2 years or so. Well, this is the splash page of, at the time, was a Marvel grade B group called the X-Men. And Steranko decides to do a 2-issue stint. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this incredibly dynamic graphic splash page is because I wanted to show you his first X-Men cover. Now, you see that X-Men logo? That's not his. That was the original logo, probably designed by Artie Simek at Marvel, the great Artie Simek, or maybe it was Saul Brodsky, one of their early letterers. I bet Simek. And Steranko comes in, and the very next issue, he designs this X-Men logo, which I believe is that the logo that they're still using? I'm not sure, but there is Steranko's beautiful monochromatic green cover, and then another great double page spread. These stories, I think the inking suffers with the art. It's not really sympathetic inking. I don't consider a lot of the art in these X-Men issues to be as superlative as some of the others. But the next shockwave that Steranko sends in 1968, while he's knocking out these S.H.I.E.L.D. covers, is the right-hand cover. That's the great John Buscema on the left, doing his first incredible stint on the Avengers in the late 60s. But let's turn our attention to this pretty awesome Hulk annual cover by Steranko. Once again, it's become an icon, being paid homage to in so many ways, both two-dimensionally and literally in 3 dimensions. This is a piece of stained glass in a mirrored frame, if you can kind of see that on the exterior. Steranko himself has paid homage to his own cover with this image of his sword and sorcery character named Talon. And there is the black and white original line art for the Hulk image. Now, there it is in color. And yet, when we come in close, as you'll see, this is what ended up being released. This isn't what we saw in the house ad. That head is a patch by the then Marvel artist Maurice Severin, possibly inked by John Romita. As you can see, very, very different from Steranko's, much more savage Hulk. And Stan Lee probably made the decision that it was not what was called on model enough, Now, you can only imagine what Steranko must have thought when he saw this. Maybe this is why, not too long after he did this cover in 1968, he must have done this in the spring or right after he finished the Captain America trilogy. I mean, right after he finished his stint on S.H.I.E.L.D. But this is when he starts work on what would become another one of his mini masterpieces, his trilogy of Captain America stories that would appear in late 1968. And maybe with this cover and that berserk looking Hulk, it's Steranko getting his revenge on Marvel Comics. Now, once again, look at his logo versus the previous logo, which I actually like. I think, to me, this is the great Captain America logo when Kirby was doing it before Steranko does this trilogy. But he designs that font. Now, when you opened up the cover, we were met with this pretty iconic splash page, which begins with a very, once again, cinematic approach to a sequence in which a lone figure walks towards us. So when an artist does identical size frames in a row like this, you get that feeling of the frames of film. Now, once again, 20 years earlier, Will Eisner would really innovate this in the spirit many times over with sequences like this. In the early 50s, the great Bernard Krigstein at EC Comics, in the masterpiece known as Master Race, about a Nazi Holocaust survivor recognizing the Commandant in the New York City subway. But that sequence that looks like film on paper became iconic. And then, of course, Steranko would resurrect these ideas when he started doing S.H.I.E.L.D. in 1967. So, 2 years later, or not even 2 years, he's giving us this. And then, like a great director, cuts to this full screenshot, which once again has a flavor of the great Eisner spirit splash pages and the mood they evoke, because you feel that winter night in the amount of graphic information Eisner gives us, in the same way what that cigarette lighter lighting up and that smoke trail feels like. You've seen it in every movie you've ever seen. We turn the page, and Steranko will basically treat this Captain America trilogy as, and I think I said this already, a primer in the art of superheroic comic book action, using all the tools of verbal and visual elements that comic art is known for. Now, this figure, the anatomy couldn't exist in the real world, just like Kirby's, but Steranko makes it work dynamically and graphically. Look at how the English version of Rolling Stone in '69, a year later after this came out, uses it for their cover. Steranko's double page spreads were his take, once again, a supercharged version of all the great Jack Kirby Captain America double page spreads, fighting, the bad guys with his kid sidekick, Bucky. All of Steranko's tools in his toolbox, some of which we had seen a year earlier in S.H.I.E.L.D. Steranko knew when to use these very graphic effects. So a couple months earlier, he gave us this gem, and he turns around and gives us this white cover with those psychedelic covers. And if you weren't blown away enough by covers like this, you'd be hit with a splash page that looked like this. Right away, you're at a movie arcade, at a what do you call it? A circus arcade, and the cacophonous sounds, and just like a director making quick cuts to give you the feeling of the immersion in multimedia that you find yourself in one of these very, Las Vegas type arcades, or maybe Jersey Shore. And Steranko always ends on that bottom right panel, knowing that you have to turn the page. Once again, your eye is met with both the incredible use of white space, going from the left-hand side of the spread to the right-hand side, but acting totally differently. The use of white in the way Steranko does the silhouettes. I mean, this has to be, just as a pure artist, one of my favorite Steranko images. The shock of going to black and white, the use of zipatone, and the use of silhouettes to give a feeling of depth. You feel the space in that white space of about 12 feet, I'd say. Then there's a couple of graphic techniques. There's that craft tint again in the top middle panel there of this double page spread. You get the little bit of cinematic chopping up of panels in the bottom in his vault sequence there. I remember as a kid reading these, and just every page was it was like a multimedia barrage of every panel being a kind of having an effect that Steranko wanted you to have. That's the master storyteller. Now you turn this page and you'd be hit with this. Now, in actuality, this incredible spread was broken up by a page of ads. Imagine Steranko had no power over that. But this is, I think, how he intended this art to be seen. And that's the way I decided as a presenter to present it. But here we get Steranko in full surrealist mode. Now, remember, he had already done that Nick Fury cover just a couple months prior. So here is yet another take on that Dali perspective lines that he uses with Bucky. We also get in this beautiful opening graphic sequence of the figure running on the surrealist landscape. This figure running on a surrealist landscape, that's Salvador Dali's design in Alfred Hitchcock's 1947 film Spellbound, which also features many Dali designs like this beautiful giant eyeball, which you can see Steranko paying homage to in the background of that image. Also, I'm assuming Steranko colored all of these comics because the color choices are not your standard, what's called local color, where a colorist would just slap down the color flesh. But there's Steranko using color as a graphic designer would to get across the effect that he wants you, the reader, to take from his manipulation of words and images. And then with his great sense of timing, once again, let's take a look at that beautiful spread. And then Steranko could give us double page spreads like this, maybe in the same issue, I forget. Now that looks like the FDR Drive up by the United Nations. It looks like in the background there. I'm sure that was what Steranko, maybe he had photo reference for this one. Once again, notice the coloring in the upper right panels. That is not standard comic coloring. And how Steranko manipulates monochromes so that when you get to the bottom of this double page spread, the cliffhanger of the second issue in the trilogy, man. Then we got this masterpiece, the third issue in the trilogy. I mean, now I've fallen in love with the logo and the way Steranko uses it here. The beautiful coloring. Look at that background. The mood. I mean, talk about a picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's the cliche come to life. Look at how much difference that beautiful coloring makes when you see the image rendered in pure black and white line art. I mean, this isn't your standard comic book coloring, folks, but it's a masterpiece. Here's Steranko using, at the time, you know, a very sort of new technique of television frames to advance the story. I think this is right around the time Neil Adams is doing it as well. So they're kind of doing this side by side. In this issue, Madame Hydra's origin is revealed, which is really tragic. And you can see in the panels on the right-hand page, this is pretty much where Quentin Tarantino got for his backstory for the Lucy Liu character in Kill Bill. This double page spread was exciting because we got to see Steranko's take on the other Marvel characters. I'm sure he had photo reference for that Black Panther pose. I don't think he just come up, that looks like a bodybuilder position. Nice idea with the mask there. And then we get this, once again, the breakdown of a scene in vertical panels to make you, the reader, follow along the same way a camera would track or dolly in a scene. Then we get the death scene. Steranko uses blacks, obviously, in his backgrounds here. Just, you can tell that every panel is, again, a primer in comic book storytelling, how to change your point of view, how to pace your story, how to break up text and image, how to zoom in for a close-up and then pull back. Now you can see there's a lot of action going on, pretty much standard layout for this spread, but it builds up in tension when we get to the bottom right panel where Bucky shows up. Look at the way Steranko uses the graphic silhouettes of the stones in the bottom right panel in white silhouette against the black. I mean, that's just a beautiful little graphic exercise that Steranko just throws in there. You turn the page and we're hit with this masterpiece. Suddenly the scene is shattered by a nerve-searing roar of defiance as a dozen Hydra killers whirl about to see a high-powered motorcycle leaping from the crest of a hill. And as the thundering machine splays the marble and granite battered tombstones in its path, a sinewy red, white, and blue thunderbolt on a mission of vengeance smashes into their midst. Captain America lives. Now, I believe Steranko both penciled and inked this spread, not the rest of the issue's inker, Tom Palmer. And Steranko also lettered it as well. But yes, another one of Steranko's masterpieces. And I love the, you know, old school coloring in the background and the blue sky there, just, you know. And then he follows that up with this incredible spread. Look at the nice graphic treatment Steranko does in the lower left of Madame Hydra's kind of black and white head with the black and white background, but the color foreground, really just a nice breakup. But of course, it's the right-hand page that is the icon masterpiece that Steranko intended it to be. Now, perhaps he was influenced by the great Frank Frazetta in his famous Conan paintings, which at the time, I'm not sure if this had been painted by the time of Steranko's, but I think this one was from a 1967 Lancer paperback book cover that Steranko, I think, repainted in 1974. But it's really this image that I think forms the basis compositionally with Steranko's very similar letter A composition style. Turn the page, And yes, so many delicious graphic bites to chew on in this spread. But first and foremost, we get this mixture of word and image. I mean, we're taught this in graphic design theory class about mixing words with images to get across the desired effect. And this idea has been imitated by, I mean, so many comic artists ever since. This is merely one example from my files, and it's actually using photography in mixture. Now there's Steranko. Once again, the anatomy is a little wonky on Captain America, but kind of makes it work. And that's the final double-page spread. So if the Shield stuff wasn't wowing us, this Captain America trilogy certainly was. Here's a picture circa that time where now that Steranko had kind of done what he wanted to do at Marvel, he looked around at what else he could ply his trade. And Marvel was wanting to put out in the fall of '69 a horror anthology called Tower of Shadows. Now there's issue 1 with a cover by the ever reliable John Romita. But inside this issue would be one of Steranko's masterpieces, At the Stroke of Midnight. And you can see just from this opening splash page of a 7-page story, Steranko is using every graphic tool at his disposal to make you, the reader, see, feel, sense the actual storytelling itself, making you feel the story as well as see it and read it. And like a maestro, using every verbal, visual, color technique to get across every panel and every page's desired effect. You know, I'm not showing you this story as double page spreads, only because I want you to see that Steranko made each page work as a unit. But that would, of course, advance the story as you went along. I mean, I could probably do an entire webinar and just go through the story panel by panel, and maybe I will do that one day. But you can tell just by looking. I mean, look in the middle tier there, where Steranko switches between full color and then black and white for the flashback of the guy being pushed off his wheelchair off the cliff. I mean, you can see that. What he does with color is also just tremendous, because this is, again, old school Ben-Day dot coloring with hand-cut screens. But Steranko did all the color guides for the separators, I think in Bridgeport, where Eastern Coloring was. And I think they had a lot of housewives employed cutting screens based on color guides. How about that upper left color choice of the Zipatone gray with just the, literally every panel is a beautiful graphic, balanced composition. But then you step back and you see how they all work as an entire single scene. You see that middle tier with the 3 vertical panels of the close-up of the face. Everybody from Frank Miller to Jaime Hernandez to Mike Mignola. I mean, that entire generation of comic artists were young kids, teenagers, when they saw this. And, you know, this is, again, a kind of primer on modern comic book storytelling. Page turning, storytelling, pacing. Look at the literally warped anatomy in the red panel in the middle tier. the close-up of the face. And I think that's another Crafton panel down below. Now, I wanted to save till the end of the story to show you Steranko's cover for this issue that was rejected, probably by Stan Lee. Do you believe they rejected this incredible masterpiece for this standard John Romita safe mainstream cover? But you can see that once again in the press, Steranko is being perceived and is always putting across the message that comics are an art. And every one of his pages, you can see that they reprinted samples from At the Stroke of Midnight, as well as from his Shield stories. And then after he sort of conquers horror with that story, what does he turn his head towards? Marvel had a romance comic line of a couple of titles. So yes, in the spring of 1970, Steranko, behind a typical romance cover by Romita, would give us this little graphic gem with an entirely different style. Steranko doesn't write this one. It says as narrated to Stan Lee. So I think it's Steranko's story with, once again, dialogue by Stan Lee, which is ironic, as we'll discuss a little later. But once again, Steranko shifts gears very much like Bowie or Madonna and tailors his graphic style to fit a romance comic, to fit a love story. And as you can see, the style he chooses is this very clear line, graphic, solid, bright colored look, which is actually very popular in the late 60s and early 70s in mainstream media like paperback covers. This is one of the greats, Mike Hinge, who did many paperback covers, science fiction covers in this style. Steranko was a big fan. He ended up publishing a portfolio of many of Mike Hinge's science fiction-based works. And then studios like New York's Pushpin Graphics, of guys like Milton Glaser and Seymour Schwass, or Quas, I'm always unsure how to pronounce his name. But they used a very kind of style that harkened back to the Art Nouveau days of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and combined it with a kind of psychedelic edge. Notice this artist doesn't even sign the work, but it looks like a kind of pushpin graphic style of the time, 1969. Even in comics, people were knocking off this particular style because of the spirit of the time. Here's the great illustrator I showed you before, Bob Peak, one of the epitomes of this type of graphic style, along with Mike Hinge. Look at this Winston ad by Peak and this drawing by Peak, and how Steranko had to have been influenced by it when he drew this page in the Our Love Story story. I love when he shifts to black and white, like in the middle bottom panel. And we get to the big dramatic ending with the big, cinematic widescreen shot in the center. Little did any of us know in 1970 that we were reading what would end up being Steranko's last story for Marvel Comics. And according to his own telling, it was due to all the fights he was having with Stan Lee. And yet his final story has the dialogue and narration written by Lee. Maybe they fought over this story, but ironic that Steranko would end his comic career on his terms. By the end of the decade, look how Marvel is billing him as the caliph of creativity. And yes, he was being dubbed as the Jimi Hendrix of comics because his career coincides with Hendrix' similar meteoric rise from 66 to 70. The only difference is Hendrix dies in 70, but Steranko doesn't, thank God. He goes on to create a couple of works in the early 70s outside of comics that nevertheless I would consider to be part of his supercharged psychedelia. And that would be this image behind him in this photograph, which would be this wraparound tabloid-sized book called The Steranko History of Comics. Really the first book of its kind. Steranko would design it. Nobody had ever seen, graphic design like this. It was all black and white interior, only the color cover. But it's the best nonfiction story of the early golden age of comics, told by the major players. And Steranko is as great of a prose writer as he is an artist and a letterer and a graphic designer. Look at how he used his favorite character, Captain America, to sell the book. And by the way, you talk about independent publishing. Steranko was doing it right from the start, self-publishing, and only $1.98, greatest bargain of the time. But, it's still in print. You can still find it. So right around that time, Steranko does one or two rare fanzines where he would do a brand new drawing of his favorite Captain America. I believe this came out in 1969. And it was right around that time that we see this image. Maybe Steranko's single greatest Captain America image. I don't think he chose that typeface down below. Maybe he did, but this was a poster that would end up being the centerpiece of, yes, Marvel Mania's catalog in 1970. Marvel Mania was the Marvel fan group that was formed in late 69 and only ran 2 or 3 years, but it produced some incredible merchandise, great posters like Steranko's Captain America. And you can see how that Captain America pose from the white cover is being used as the centerpiece of their sticker sheet. He also supplied some groovy Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. art in black and white. The Hulk, well, that made sense because he did that Hulk cover. Pretty funky leg on the Hulk there in the foreground, but whatever, we'll forgive Steranko for that. And how about Steranko's Spider-Man for Marvel Mania? I was never quite sure if I liked it or not. Look how they were selling all 4 posters in black and white. You believe it? For $1.50 for all 4. No, all 4. Yeah, $1.50. How about that? 3 feet high. And then in 1972, what would Steranko follow up? That was History of Comics Volume 1. Yes, Volume 2, with a similar beautiful wraparound cover of the kind of second half of the 1940s that he would feature in this tabloid-sized history book. Now, again, unless you saw that Harvey special, you had to wonder, who is this character next to Captain America? Yeah, that would be Will Eisner's The Spirit. Here he's shown in a photograph, circa 1971-72, working on the full-page image for his buddy Jim Steranko to use in the History of Comics Volume 2 to kick off the Spirit chapter. The Spirit chapter was very significant because for many of us, as I said, it was our introduction to the character. I had missed those Harvey annuals in '66, and that was already 6 years ago, ancient history. So I had never known about the Spirit, and I think a lot of readers didn't, because Steranko, in addition to a great chapter discussing it in his inimitable prose style, also reprinted an entire 7-page story. And again, for many of us, it blew our minds because we had never seen anything like it. But we soon saw where Steranko got so many of his innovative storytelling devices. He was again influenced by Eisner. Perhaps the last piece Steranko does for Marvel at this time to kind of close off his supercharged psychedelic era is this image of all of his characters that he had done between Nick Fury and Captain America. And yes, this was a Christmas card or a Christmas image or something. Again, it's got to be circa 69, 70. I don't have a firm date. And there in the center, of course, is his doppelganger at Marvel, Nick Fury, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I can't go through Steranko's next 50 years of the work that he's been doing outside of comics, but every now and then popping into comics and being covered as a true American artist, celebrity, by Entertainment Weekly itself a couple of years ago with this double-page spread about Steranko and his continual influence and study. The infinitely incredible, impossible life of Jim Steranko, it says. He's been a criminal, an escape artist, and a rocker, and he remains one of the most influential comic book artists and writers ever. Meet the man who made Nick Fury cool and gave Indiana Jones the bullet. Well, once again, in one webinar, I can't give you all of Steranko's work after his psychedelic era. Of course, in the 1970s, and really ever since, he's been working on this ever-evolving graphic novel of his character, his film noir doppelganger, Chandler. Now, this image, created in the 70s, ended up being used as the poster and the catalog cover for one of the very first art gallery studies of a single comic artist. And his Chandler graphic novel, I remember seeing the pages for before they were published. I believe at the 1976 Phil Seuling July 4th convention. And I thought they were inked in India ink, but I remember looking close up. And of course, this reproduction makes them look like ink, but they were actually tightly penciled drawings. You had to go this close, 6 inches away, to notice that they were meticulously filled in pencil illustrations. Now, over the decades, Steranko in the post-computer era has decided instead to render Chandler in computer color. And yes, this is a double-page spread for the graphic novel that still has not been published. Like many of Steranko's projects, he does a few tantalizing images, but, you know, we're still waiting for this version of his graphic novel, which now will be titled Red Tide. Now, that was in the 70s he started doing this Chandler work. In the 80s, you probably saw at the dawn of the decade, the B science fiction movie with the A-list star Sean Connery, Outland, but you probably never saw the graphic novel version that Steranko did, probably bankrolled by European publisher, collected in Metal Arlen, heavy metal in Europe, never reprinted in English. It was serialized in Heavy Metal magazine in English, but it's never been collected. And yet it features some of Steranko's great graphic storytelling with, once again, narrative devices that everybody from Brian Michael Bendis on down are using ever since in their storytelling. Even the high contrast black and white look that Steranko develops in Outland, just every spread is once again a mini masterpiece. Follow the action in the spread as the character is hit in the middle vertical panel there and falls off the space station. Then in the penultimate panel, hits in black and white, and then falls into space as a white silhouette. Once again, just, it's the little things, you know, the genius is in the details with Steranko. Remember I said he would pop in out of nowhere and do an incredible comic book piece? Yeah, in the middle of 1984, in the 400th issue of Superman, behind a Howard Chaykin painted cover, Steranko drops this little, I think it was an 8-page story. That Steranko letters as well in his inimitable type style. And once again, it's Steranko, the designer and the storyteller and the color artist and the guy that never left his psychedelia behind, manipulating everything to get across the story he wants to tell. In the modern era, in the 21st century, you can get Steranko's work in so many ways. IDW is publishing these artist editions, which are tabloid size facsimile reprints of the black and white original art. So you get to see Steranko's original pages, like this surrealist cover and this Nick Fury Captain America mashup. Now, speaking of homages, Steranko himself will pay homage to his Nick Fury Captain America image with a modern interpretation that looks like this. Steranko, of course, is on the computer coloring, and you can see that his, you know, ability to manipulate type and everything. And speaking of homages, I mean, this is from a Trade magazine double-page spread article about I just gave you a hint of all the homages to so many of his images, but you can see in that strip below how many there have been. And yet maybe his #1 most iconic image is the image ghosted in gray tone behind. And that would be, of course, that Captain America white cover with the psychedelic background. I mean, every collection of Steranko's work, that trilogy, has been reprinted multiple times in Europe and in America, and they will always use, I guess they got Steranko to do this variation on it because it's signed by Steranko. Another IDW edition, I don't think this one's come out yet, but there's the cover for it. But maybe my favorite use of this image has to be the Hot Wheels version. Yes, for some reason, God bless the product designer or whoever, the package designer at whoever has the Hot Wheels account, but how they got Steranko's Captain America on here, God bless. Now, I know this is real, but I also know when I find images like this on the internet that it's not real, but man, we wish it were real. All of us who love comic art and love Steranko, can you imagine if stuff like this actually existed? But for many of us, this is our dream. This is our icon. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for attending the supercharged psychedelia of Jim Steranko. This has been one of my comics history projects that if you go into my website, folks, arlenschumer.com, you can see all of my different pop culture areas of interest. My website's linked to my book selling site where I will sign and sketch in a hardcover copy of my Silver Age book with, I think, the best treatment of Steranko's work that's ever been done. I showed you the introductory title page spread, but all the images that I've shown you tonight, you can see how I integrated them with my text and with quotes from Steranko himself. Here I show all of those and some more that I didn't show of Steranko's homage images to both Eisner and Wally Wood. Here I give you that incredible 4-page panoramic scenes that you can enjoy as a single scene. I grouped all of the great white covers into this white spread, and notice everything that I learned from Steranko, that all the type, there's a red column, a yellow, and a blue, and just trying to keep in the spirit graphically of what Steranko did. I call this the surreal spread, where I grouped the shield, the Captain America, and the stroke of midnight with some really great text quotes that are very rare. Remember, I said there were only a handful of fanzines that covered Steranko. Here I group all of Steranko's moon images. Yes, every image here has a classic graphic moon. And now you have them all on one great spread with some great quotes by Steranko. Captain America is my favorite comic book character, top of my list. From the time I was a kid acting out his adventures and brandishing the circular lid of a washing machine on which I taped a red star. And then how about this quote over on his other Captain America iconic image? I was ecstatic about working on the title. He was, still is, the personification of patriotism, an American icon, not the kind of character one assumes easily. I don't think I ever got it precisely right the way I saw it in my head, but each issue is getting closer to the way I wanted to see Captain America. Folks, I run a Facebook group devoted to the Silver Age itself, one just on Jack Kirby, and one on perhaps my biggest influence, Neil Adams, on my own illustration work, doing comic book style art for advertising and editorial usage. One of my specialties is actually turning real people into comics and keeping the photographic look. I'm also linked to the commercial site TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my images and every knick-knack, gewgaw, and tchotchke known to man. I have my own merchandise site where I sell posters linked from my website of images not on TeePublic for various reasons, copyright usually. And then there's my visual lectures, which I used to call what I did live before the pandemic, and my webinars. It's linked to my YouTube channel where you can see videos of my most recent webinars and my older live lectures, like the very first time I lectured on Steranko's Captain America on the 50th anniversary back in 2019. I also developed a July 4th webinar combining Kirby's and Steranko's Captain America in one webinar. I've done this a couple of times for New York Adventure Club, which is the great company I hooked up with when the pandemic shutdown hit a year ago, doing webinars for them. These are ticketed events, but buying a ticket allows you to watch a recording of the webinar for up to a week afterwards. So next Tuesday, to officially end August, I'll be doing one of my favorite subjects, Roy Lichtenstein, and the origins of pop art. If you go to my website on the events blog, I always post all of my comings and goings with all of their various links to make it easier for you folks. So if you ever want to know what I'm up to or make sure you have all the info, that's where to go. So once again, folks, thank you for attending this webinar. Boy, what did I say? An hour and a half, right on time, folks. And with that, we shall return to our regularly scheduled program. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.